welcome back to Special Ed on Special Ed. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm very excited for today's episode because we have Dr. Judy Grossman, who is the Associate Director of the Center for the Developing Child and Family at the Ackerman Institute for the Family. I got it all out that time. And we're going to talk about social emotional learning. So stay tuned. I'm going to run my disclaimer before we say a word, and then we'll jump right into it.
The information in this podcast is provided for general informational and entertainment purposes only and may not reflect the current law in your jurisdiction at the time you're listening. Nothing in this episode creates an attorney-client relationship, nor is it legal advice. Do not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any information included in or accessible through this episode without seeking appropriate legal or other professional advice on the particular facts and circumstances at issue from a lawyer or service provider licensed in your state, country, or other appropriate licensing jurisdiction.
Great. Dr. Grossman, thank you so much for joining me today. I was able to get out your very long title, but I would love it if you would give us a little background on you and why you are the one that I need to have teach me about social emotional learning.
Okay. First of all, thanks for having me. Thrilled to be talking to the parents that are listening or whomever. I actually started my career as an OT and then went into academia and did some policy research in special ed and became a family therapist. I mean, I've had many, many different experiences. My area of focus has always been family resilience, even before we used that term. You know, years ago, we only talked about risks and deficits, but, you know, there's been a change, long time coming, in looking at strengths and resilience. And I started a project for family therapists to work specifically with families with neurodiverse children. And that's because all my experience has taught me that there are layers to the work. So you may be a very competent family therapist, or you may be an excellent educator in special ed, but you need the whole package. So if you're doing clinical work that's more in the area of mental health, you need to understand the IEP and the different diagnoses. And on top of interest in family resilience, most of my work deals with the parents, because parents are so significant and situations can be so stressful. And they often search for skills or strategies to help them manage their child's behavior or even keep themselves regulated when they're getting upset. So social emotional learning is, I would say it's a term that's been around since the 90s. Mm-hmm. There's a consortium of researchers, policymakers, educators, clinicians, everybody that's interested in evidence-based practice in terms of social emotional learning. And after the pandemic, or I shouldn't say that, we're still in the pandemic, actually.
Right. We're not sure it's over yet.
I'm actually getting over COVID right now myself. So we are in the midst of it.
I think we're over the initial shock of the pandemic. Maybe that's what we're through, the initial shock.
Well, I think the one thing, we've learned a couple of things. One is children are struggling with anxiety and depression, and for some, even PTSD. Mm-hmm. This has been very challenging and continues to be very challenging for students. Second thing we learned, which I know the past 40 plus 50, long time, is that parents are so important in supporting their child's total development, but particularly the social emotional development, because you're the model, you're the coach. A lot of it has to do with your own development of social emotional skills. And I think that the pandemic has raised awareness that it's so important for schools to partner with parents.
Yeah. And I think that's how I sort of came to it. Was I had an older child who was neurodiverse, who was not able to identify her own emotions and feelings. And so as a family, we sort of had to learn to talk in this way of explaining ourselves
Mhm.
and explaining our emotions and our feelings as they were happening in sort of a way to help educate her. And what I learned was I have 3 of my 5 children have a traumatic background and they're adopted. But what I learned through this process was it was significantly benefiting my neurotypical child. And I mean, I don't know that anyone in my house is neurotypical, but whatever. You get the idea. Is that these pieces that I was putting into place for a specific reason, for a specific disability, for a specific need, actually applied to everybody in the house. And that's how I started to sort of identify that. And now that, as you say, the pandemic brought much more awareness to the forefront. And I agree with you. I think it's critical that we as parents understand our role in that. Because when you tell a child you need to be doing this, but you're not doing it yourself,
Right.
that's always my favorite when parents are like, well, I'm definitely getting them into therapy. And I'll say, well, do you have a therapist? And parents will say, well, no, I don't need one.
So you've made a couple of really good points, Dana. One is this is universal. Every child and adult will have better life success if they have good social, emotional awareness. They understand, can label their own feelings. They can begin to identify feelings in others and develop empathy. They have good relationships. And most importantly, particularly with neurodiverse children, that the child can regulate. So emotional regulation, meaning, they don't have these uncontrollable outbursts, but they can find ways to self-soothe and cope. And another piece of that is co-regulation. So children who aren't able to do that, the parent has to sort of be their prefrontal cortex and help them regulate. So there are a lot of different dimensions to social emotional learning, but the state of the art, so to speak, is that there are many curriculum, and many of them are endorsed by CASEL, which is this consortium for collaborative social emotional educational learning, and they're school-wide. So, a school might be interested in paying more attention to social emotional learning, and we can talk about what the research says. And more schools are adopting different curriculum. So it's helpful for parents to know, what is your curriculum in social emotional learning.
So why would that be important for a parent to understand the specific curriculum? Is it that the language is different depending on the curriculum, or how does that fit into what's going on at home?
Okay, so it actually is less about which one, but knowing that they have one.
Oh, okay.
And I think that what goes on at home should complement the language that they're using in school.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a disconnect. And, there are many, many ways to do this. I mean, I often do train people to do groups with parents and their children to learn these skills. And the earlier, the better. I mean, you can, start social emotional learning with infants.
Yeah.
In terms of how you help them soothe, and your narrative, your storytelling always includes feeling words. So in terms of the steps in social emotional learning, I would say the first step is just labeling feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Yours, your husband's or partners, the other children in the family, and, take advantage of 24/7 teachable moments. Oh, wow. You see those people there? They're having an argument. They look like they're so angry at each other. Or you're watching a movie. Wow, he's so kind because he keeps trying to help his friend, so forth and so on. So this is something that can be done, woven into family life. And if you have a child that has difficulty labeling feelings, you become curious. And let's say you're watching your child doing homework and they're having a hard time. You can say, I'm wondering if you're frustrated. I mean, you're looking frustrated to me. Is that how you're feeling? So you don't tell the child how he or she is feeling, but you probe, you ask a question. And eventually children will be able, they'll be more in touch and be able to name how they feel. And once you have a name, there's a term, name it to tame it. That helps you feel more in control. If you just have this amorphous, let's say you feel anxious, but you don't really know that that's anxiety.
Right.
You're uncomfortable. You might have bodily signals and you don't know what they mean. And you might say every night, my tummy hurts, my tummy hurts. Well, that might be the signal for that child that means that you're worried, that you're anxious, that you're stressed.
Yeah, that there's physical responses, that it's not. I think that's an important piece too, is to understand, especially for kids in school, when I see a child who visits the nurse a lot, my first thought is, okay, that's anxiety. That's, they're fearful of something. They're worried about something. They're escaping from something. Like that to me is the first sign, right? That
Exactly.
they've removed themselves.
Exactly. They may want to avoid something or escape, or they may just be overstimulated and they don't understand that. They just know they need a break. So that's really the first step. I mean, until someone has some self-awareness, and when I work with parents, I always encourage a lot of self-reflection, because there's a term, meta-emotion, how people feel about feelings. Yeah, so some people are not comfortable with angry feelings. They don't know how to express them. Some people have a lot of trouble handling when their child seems sad. And feelings are feelings.
I think that's our natural response, right? Our child is sad. I want you to feel better. So I'm just going to immediately try to make you feel better and tell you feel better. And that's not a big deal. It's not upsetting. Don't worry about it. But what I'm saying is your feelings don't matter and they're not real.
That's apparent.
Right?
That's dismissive, which is not helpful, because that is saying your feelings don't matter, or this feeling is not a feeling that we want to talk about or notice.
And I find for parents, sometimes it's hard to see when it wasn't our intent to harm a child. It's really hard to acknowledge that's what we did, because I think in the back of our mind, that's so the worst thing we could do is harm a child. That's like our natural reaction is to not do that. That concept is so overwhelming that our first response is to be like, no, I didn't mean that. So it didn't happen.
Well,
right?
That's right. But the other piece to it is harming a child is a strong word. No parent ever gets it all right all the time. Nobody. So sometimes it's about repair. So, if you're learning some of these skills yourself about how to label how you're feeling and help your child label how he or she is feeling, the parent becomes more skillful. And if you recognize that you did something that retrospectively you feel you didn't handle well, you can be transparent and say, I was just thinking about what happened this morning. And, I'm really sorry because you were looking so sad and I didn't really give you a chance to tell me more about it. Would you like to do that? And the child might say yes or no. The other thing is a very important piece of social emotional learning is this self-regulation. And some parents are not well regulated. And in my work, my work includes research and clinical and academic teaching and so forth, I always start with helping the parent regulate. Because if the parent gets triggered by the child's behavior and then they get upset and they sort of get aroused and rev up, that's only going to create with the child's dysregulation, essentially. So no matter what, the first step is for the parent to stay calm. And I think it's very helpful for parents to be explicit about it. Like, let's say, you asked your child 10 times to do something, they didn't do it, and you're getting annoyed, and, you're just sort of going up the scale. You can say, I'm going up the scale, or I use thermometers, feeling thermometers, but whatever. who we want to talk about. And I don't want to start yelling. That's not going to help us. So I'm going to take a minute because I know it helps me if I take a few deep breaths. So you're modeling to the child that you are working on controlling your reactions. So rather than be reactive, you want to be responsive. So you're modeling that, and you have to have a strategy. One part is noticing when you get aroused, or the parent being able to monitor and knowing what's the point of no return, so to speak. At some point, forget it. You can't really talk about it in a logical way. But then you have to know what to do. And so, I usually have family activities where everybody talks about the different ways they control themselves or calm themselves down or cope with stress.
Yeah.
That's a very, very important piece.
Is a parent understanding themselves and being able to control and regulate. Yeah. And it's I find almost impossible for me to identify myself. I have to be able to rely on, we have this thing in I'm very I'm loud. My hands are always going. I'm all over the place. And my husband's super chill and, whatever. So my yelling and his yelling are two different things.
Right.
I remember he once raised his voice once and the kids were like, "Don't yell at mommy." And his response was, "She yells at me all the time." Yeah. And they said, "Yeah, but that's how she talks." And it was funny for me to be like, oh, they so differentiate between us, how I am compared to myself, not how I am compared to him. And I just thought that was fascinating to me that they had picked up on that little bit, that they were aware. They didn't think I was yelling all the time, because they were accustomed to my personality. And to me, that was showing me how in tune the kids are.
Exactly. Kids are incredibly attuned to the parents' emotional state. And even toddlers, you could see a toddler, if he sees the mom looking sad, go over and, sort of comfort the parent. Now, they don't even really understand what they're doing, but it's in the air. It's an exquisite skill that children have. And, parents might try to mask it, which is hard. I mean, I'm working with a very depressed mom right now, and, she's doing her best to function normally, but I can't imagine her children don't pick something up.
Yeah. And I hear that a lot too with parents when they have something major to tell their kids, whether it's a divorce or separation or a move or what have you. And they've been waiting to tell them for some reason. And I always ask them, did they know? Did they know? Were they upset? And a lot of the time it's oh, they had a sense, or they were relieved that whatever it was said because they knew something was coming, they're just, I think we as adults like to pretend that we're tricking them, but we're really not. We've trained them to tell us what we want to hear.
Yeah. And we want to protect them.
Yes.
That's just an instinct. And you can't always. And, that doesn't mean that you can't help them deal with, I often say anxiety is catching in families. And, it might be a situation where you just overt about it and say, you recognize that, this is normal behavior for mommy, which is different than normal behavior for daddy. And that's fine. People are different. The thing about social emotional. Oh, do you want to ask a question?
I'm sorry, I was muted. I was just saying, I think it's important for them to be able to distinguish between personality and emotion and feeling. And my oldest, who's neurodiverse, has nonverbal learning disabilities. So it's very difficult for her to identify any of those social cues that we take for granted, But so to be able to distinguish between that's your personality, you're fiery and you're loud, versus someone who's fiery and loud is mean or mad or angry or
Right.
however you define it. It's much more complicated than we think, and we so take it for granted. I'm curious, how do you approach families? Because sometimes I run into this where families say they just need to suck it up. They just need to get through. They need to get a tougher skin. And I've been that parent where I, said, oh my God, my kids are snowflakes. What is happening? But at the same time, I think about the pain that I experienced not being able to share my emotions with somebody or not being able to identify them myself. So I'm coming from that perspective. But how do you reach a parent who maybe doesn't see that, the benefit necessarily? They know their kid needs it, but they're not internalizing it.
Well, that goes back to the research and what we're learning. So social emotional learning, which is the title that Castle uses, this consortium, it could be called emotional intelligence or emotional literacy. It's also referred to as non-cognitive skills. And, schools are all about academics and cognitive development and language development and, achievement.
Which all plays into it.
Right. But if a child is not regulated, if a child is distracted, if a child is in a stress response, if a child is feeling anxious, they're not taking in the information. They're not absorbing and integrating what the teacher's saying. So there have been over 20 years of research, way more, short-term and long-term studies showing that there is a relationship between better social emotional skills and academic performance. There is a relationship between social emotional skills and relationships and self-awareness and behavior in school and at home. So I consider it, what should I say? I never said this before. The word just came into my mind, like a nest. That this is social emotional learning. And then you build all the academic cognitive skills. But if you're not present,
right,
you're not really learning optimally.
Yes, and we actually experienced that as well. One of my children, who between evaluations, their IQ went up, and I'm using air quotes that you can't see right now, went up 16 points.
Wow.
And at her age, that's not, your IQ doesn't make that kind of leap,
Exactly.
in that short period of time. And she had gone from an environment that was not safe to her in her mind, and had to spend, not just enter into a safer environment. She had to spend a great deal of time in that safer environment before she became available for learning.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's how we looked at it, because I was like, there's not suddenly this, what I was thrilled about her educational environment at that time is that it was meeting those safety needs. And that was my only priority for her at the time. And the academics came,
That's a very good example.
Everything went up when we only focused on making sure she felt safe. And that was our only priority. That's when she did well academically.
Well, you're exactly right. And, safety is, what could I say? Without that, any of this is not going to develop. So, children that experience a lot of trauma, number one, need safety and trust in relationships. Another thing about, trauma and how it relates to this, I think we underestimate the amount of trauma people have in life. There are a lot of studies about this now. Trauma-informed care is like the name of the game.
It's a catchphrase. It's the buzz phrase.
Right. But let's just say your child has ADHD. Now, this is separate from trauma. The extra energy that they need to pay attention, to stay seated, to, especially if they have the hyperactive piece, to modulate their body is exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
And so even that takes away from learning.
Right. And I think people forget that when kids are exhausted, they don't roll over and go to sleep.
Right.
They tend to have a fit. They tend to keep going in their exhausted state. They're not aware enough to rest. And I think we forget that.
Yeah. And also, we see it in the transition from school to home.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the teacher will say, he's not a behavior problem. I mean, he's doing fine. And he has some friends, and then the child comes home and opens the door and he has a temper tantrum and totally escalates. And the parents saying, what's going on? I mean, is this a
different kids
that comes home from the child that's in school? Very common. I mean, I hear that all the time.
How do you help schools bridge that gap? Or parents and schools? How do you, I have that happen a lot. Obviously, with my clients, I have, my clients are children with disabilities. And a lot of the time they are holding it together to the best of their ability from, morning to dismissal. And then they get home and there's nothing left. There's no emotional control. There's no making the child happy. There's no nothing. Like they have just been pushed over the edge. But the school is seeing a great kid that's being social and talking to friends and doing their work. And the parents are seeing a kid that's about to blow.
Right.
How do we help bridge that gap?
Well, a couple of ideas. One is, because this is so common, one is what you can do at home. So to be articulate about it and have maybe a transition ritual with the child, because you're anticipating and you make that obvious. And, the ritual might be, what's the most common thing you can do with the child at that moment? Is it to give them something to eat? Or is it to have them do some kind of physical aerobic kind of activity? Whatever it is. But make it overt. And think about, this is just what the parent can do. Think about creating a coming home ritual. As a therapist, when I work with families, everything is a suggestion because we never really know what's going to work. A lot of it's trial and error. But for some families, that works. In terms of the school, and I've been doing this work a long time. I mean, I'm training related service providers because I'm also an OT. Training related service providers and training special educators and training psychologists and, people from different domains in this area.
Different perspectives.
Yeah. And there's so many more opportunities for parents to get information that could help them. I always say, why don't you ask the OT what she's doing to help the child regulate in the classroom? Because maybe she has some ideas for you. I mean, there's not enough transparency and communication between schools and parents. Now, some schools do this very well. I mean, I did some studies in Fairfield County, and there are some school districts, well, you don't call them districts, but there's some communities that do it very well. Most of my work was in New York City. And, I mean,
it's a different animal in New York City.
Well, yeah. And so sometimes there's absolutely no communication. And parents they have a right to information, and they would benefit a great deal because they want other ideas, other strategies. Is there something that's working in school? Does a behavior plan seem to work in school? Is that something you should try at home?
Right. And from a special ed attorney perspective, I would also look at that as, parent training. From a school perspective, another thing that I often recommend for parents is evaluations. And if they think that they are seeing a completely different child than their school district and they're not able to bridge that gap, that either bringing in the private therapist that they're working with to give their input, or collaborating with the school to get an outside evaluation, maybe somebody who isn't in school. Because if people in school aren't seeing what the parents are seeing and the parents aren't seeing what school is seeing, then maybe we need somebody completely separate to come in and tell us where all these pieces connect. And I find that to sometimes be the hardest thing. And once we can make that connection and everyone can see how all those pieces work together and how home is impacting school and vice versa, then we can start putting pieces into place. How would you advise parents or teachers who think, we have a gap, we need to bridge this gap? Where can we get the information we need? Who should they be going to for that assessment or instruction?
Well, you're talking about quite a few different things. So,
okay, that's probably.
So let's see if I can answer it in a way that's helpful. Schools are mandated to, if a child has an IEP, to decide on placement and services to enhance their academic performance. That's as it's written.
Mm-hmm.
I'm suggesting academic performance is not as narrow a lane as they say. I did special ed policy research for a decade, and there's such variability in terms of a school district partnering and believing in strength-based partnering with parents, in understanding what the parents' concerns are, what their priorities are, as opposed to, let's look at the IEP and, look at a very specific skill.
Mm-hmm.
They don't necessarily think of the whole child.
Right.
So parents have a right to request a meeting if a child has an IEP. Parents have a right to have the child evaluated if they feel there's a problem. Usually it comes from the school suggesting to the parent. However, I know parents' instinct lets them know something's not quite right.
Mm-hmm.
And so they need the validation. They may feel for years, I just think there's something that he's not getting. And then grade 3, he still can't read. He's very frustrated. He has a lot of outbursts. But the parent knew.
Right.
And we are diagnosing earlier and earlier. We're diagnosing, now where it is approved to diagnose children as young as 4 with ADHD, which was not the case before. But I can go into a preschool and look in the classroom and identify 2 to 3 children that are neurodiverse. And I'm a preventionist. My doctorate's in public health. I'm all about prevention. And if a child has a neurobiological disability, you really can do prevention work in terms of his emotional life and not feeling I'm not good enough. I'm a bad boy. I hear those things from children all the time, and they're devastating for parents.
Yeah. Well, and I think we don't realize too that by calling a child a good boy indicates to the other children that then they are bad. Like, I think they're little pieces of language that we've become very careless with our language, I think. And I think that is part of our social emotional problem, because when you're careless with your language, you're sending messages that maybe you didn't intend to send. And I think it's in my lifetime that we've actually, as a society, started to acknowledge that kids have feelings. I know when I was little, that wasn't the forefront of the conversation, and even my mom talks about when she was pregnant, there was only one patient.
Yeah.
It was the mom. Right. So it started right from there. So, I think that we are definitely coming into a new understanding, even though these ideas and concepts and knowledge have been around forever. I think as a society, we have not been taking it seriously.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The power of language, good, bad, really you want to describe behavior, oh, you finished that assignment very well. And, that was great because you're being a good student or whatever. You talk about the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I had an experience in 1971, which gives you a little bit of indication of how long I've been in the parenting field. And we were doing a prevention program in Spanish Harlem with little kids. And everything was about, do the children know their colors? And do they know shapes? And it was all cognitive and language. And I had worked in mental health. And so this was a research project, federally funded. And so I started saying to the parents, what do you like about your child? I'm telling you, they struggled with answers. So this piece of recognizing someone's emotional life and how much that impacts performance and relationships. I mean, even I do a lot of work in Head Start programs.
Mm-hmm.
In 1965, the purpose of Head Start was to help children develop social competence. It wasn't academic readiness. Because if you think about, what do you need to be a successful adult? Well, you may not need algebra as much as getting along with your coworkers or having a decent marriage.
Yes. And I had that conversation in an IEP meeting the other day for a kid who's super smart. And I thought, yeah, he is, but he also can't make eye contact. If he doesn't like how you look, he will tell you. Like there are things that are not acceptable in society that this child does. And regardless of the cognitive abilities, they won't be successful. And that is what we're looking at when you talk about education being much more global than academics. And it is. And that's something that I remind IEP teams of all the time. If we're in middle school and we're talking about a middle schooler and this kid does not have any friends, that is not typical. And that is going to be more important to that student than anything else. So if we're not taking seriously what kids take seriously, then we're not acknowledging their feelings, their thoughts, what's going on in their lives. And I mean, they're human too, right? Their brains are developing to what they're going to be as adults. Now is the best time for them to learn how to do all that stuff. I just don't believe that kids have to be in pain to learn.
Well, being in pain makes it hard to learn.
Yes. I mean, but I think we have that, right? Like if a kid is enjoying their class, there's this question like, are they actually learning anything? They seem like they're having too much fun. We have to think about that. It's sort of a weird thing. Well, thank you. I so appreciate all of this information. I think it's so important for families and schools to understand that this social emotional learning piece, and you did touch on it, but it's also a little different than emotional IQ or those pieces, like how well you know yourself. It's more about social emotional learning.
It's skill development. These things can be learned.
It's skill development.
They have to be modeled. They have to be practiced. So I think a good takeaway for whomever's listening to this is becoming more comfortable with emotional coaching. So that's a term comes from John Gottman, which really means no matter what's going on, you connect emotionally with the child first. So you say, I see you're really angry because you're raising your voice, and I get it because your sister keeps taking your toys. So you're validating how the child feels, no matter how they feel. A feeling is a feeling. It needs to be respected. So before you say, but don't hit your sister, you want to first say, label the feeling, validate it. If you don't really understand, if you can't make the connection, say, but what's going on? Tell me what. I don't understand why you're so frustrated. And then you can give you can give guidance. You can make a demand. You can make a request. It just means that the child feels understood and they will listen to you. And this goes for all relationships.
It takes them off the defensive.
Yeah. I mean, everybody wants to feel understood. And, mommy gets it.
Yes.
And mommy said, I can't hit her. Okay, that doesn't mean he's not going to hit her. It means that he has to substitute a different action for demonstrating his aggression towards his sister.
I love that, the way you phrase that. It's about finding a different way to express it, right? You're identifying, I see you feel that way. I get it. That's valid. But doing that when you feel that way is not how we do it. When you feel that way, you've got to do something different. Let's figure out what that something different is. And yeah, so it's looking at what's the outcome. I've said that to, before, like, do you want the child to feel bad about themselves, or do you want to change the behavior? Which is the goal? And thinking of it that way, because I think sometimes we feel like that's character building as an adult, right? Going through those tough things and toughen it out. But, wouldn't it be better to have the tools to get through it rather than tough it out? I'm not too proud to use tools. So,
it's complex.
But it is. So Dr. Grossman, tell me, if somebody is listening to this and they're saying, oh my gosh, you speak my truth. You're the only person who gets me and I need to talk to Dr. Grossman. How are they going to find you and reach out to you and find your work?
I'm only practicing on Zoom now. Since the pandemic, I gave up my office in the city and I had an office here. I'm taking select cases because I also teach and so forth and so on. But I can be reached at Judy.Grossman928@gmail.
Great. And I will have that information in the show notes, along with the other links to some things that we have discussed during this episode. And I can't thank you enough. It really, this is such an important hot topic. And I came across it because I attended a presentation that you gave, and I think that was well attended as well. I really think that social emotional learning is on the upswing, thank God, in our community and in our society. So thank you so much for all the work you do and for sharing this information with parents.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget to follow this podcast so you don't miss any new episodes, and leave a review when you have a chance. If there's anything you want to hear about or comment on, please go to my Facebook page, Special Ed on Special Ed, and find me there. I'll see you next time here on Special Ed on Special Ed. Have a fabulous day. The views expressed in this episode are those of the speakers at the time of the recording and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company, or even that individual today.